The descent began with silence, too perfect to be natural, too measured to be benign. Beneath the basalt strata of Nocturne Theta, deeper than any hab shaft or tectonic bore, the atmosphere degraded into something older than decay. Their auspexes twitched with echoes of impossible readings. Cogitator spools jammed mid-rotation. The light from the expedition's lumen drones did not reach far. It bent and died as if the darkness refused to be observed. This was where Arkhan Land had chosen to tread. Librarius Omnis was not a ruin. It was a sealed equation, a repository of horrors too ancient for any existing creed, buried before the Martian schism, before the worship of the Omnissiah, before the universe had aligned on what was safe to remember. It was said the vault doors had not opened in 17,000 years. Land opened them with a key he should not have had, and something deeper let him in. He was not armoured like a warrior, nor did he carry the sigils of a Mechanicum emissary. He arrived in composite robes stitched with self-regulating filtration vanes, surrounded by a retinue of reconstructed Castellan-class battle automata and blank-faced data minders. His gait was slow, not reverent, but precise. He walked as though time itself were under audit. No prayer escaped his lips. Every chant spoken by his subordinates was for calibration, not devotion. The air carried none of Mars' usual incense, only the ion burn of circuit flesh. No one, not even the Iron Fathers of Riser or the Red Seers of Halcyon Gamma, knew what Land truly sought. Officially, he was here to recover remnants of old Earth's vanished standard template constructs. Unofficially, he was here to take what the Omnissiah had never authorized to return. The Librarius Omnis was a grave for STCs too dangerous to repurpose. Machines that erased the need for empires. Vehicles that could terraform continents. Bioprint for hab hives that rendered governors obsolete. Weapons that were ideas, not tools. Land didn't fear them. He wanted to make them useful again. In the first vault chamber, he found a fragment. Not a template, not even a fully rendered schematic. Just the memory imprint of a battle tank's suspension lattice. That was enough. From it came the first recursion matrix that would eventually coalesce into the vehicle that would be called Land's Raider. And with it, the Mechanicum's first theological crisis of the Crusade era. Because what Land had done was not recovery. He had reauthored the machine god's script. Each meter deeper revealed not just ancient designs, but locked confrontations, machine spirits that hissed in broken binary, architectures that fought their own blueprints. Even the vaults resisted, pressure systems inverted at random, hallways looped and rearranged. A data seraph committed mimetic suicide in Vault 19. The echo screamed for 3 days before vanishing. Land recorded everything, not to share, to catalogue, to control. They reached the 9th descent after 11 days. By then, one of his Castellans had flayed its own cortex to silence a signal no other unit detected. Land refused to destroy the damaged automaton. He had it installed with a null field rig and rearmed. It would go on to assist in the retrieval of the anti-gravitic core later transcribed into Land's speeder, but that moment had not come yet. Here, in the 9th descent, something was waiting. Not sentient, not conscious, but predatory. It is still not known what killed the first full expedition led by the Mechanicum 30 years earlier. Land's logs show no emotion upon finding their ossified remains, some still fused into the vault walls, others compacted into blocks of neural gel. No data recovery was possible, only entropy. When questioned by a younger Magos later about the meaning of these dead, Land answered only once. "They were faithful," he said. "I am correct." Then he descended farther. Before the ashes of old Earth had cooled, the Mechanicum canonized its first sin, curiosity. Not inquiry, not analysis, curiosity. To question the divine schematics, to alter the form of the Omnissiah's sacred gifts, was to commit techno-heresy. All knowledge, they claimed, already existed in perfect form within the machine god's infinite repository. To deviate was to desecrate. This was the doctrine that governed Mars for millennia. This was the foundation Land would crack open with silence and precision. He never raised a hand against it. He didn't have to. His rebellion was methodological. Where others saw schemata as holy relics, Land treated them as prototypes. Every recovered template was subjected to probabilistic stress tests, destructive mirroring, recursive code bending. He dissected meaning from geometry. He reduced liturgical cant to formatting. This wasn't innovation, it was removal. He subtracted everything not functional. What remained was horrifying. Land had no disciples, no acolytes survived his standards. He didn't train, he harvested. Every assistant was a resource, disposable, replaceable, and ultimately incompatible. The Mechanicum knew this. They feared it, but they needed him. The Great Crusade had begun, and with it, the Imperium's insatiable appetite for machines. Astartes needed transports that could traverse the warp's distortion fields. Forge worlds needed agricultural yield optimized for xeno-battered soil. Fleet logisticians begged for armored deployment vectors that could pierce atomized atmospheres. Land delivered. But he did not worship. In The Master of Mankind, his interactions with fellow Mechanicum agents are always cut short. They speak in tritone binary, quoting scripture and invoking the litany of revision. Land ignores them. When they kneel in front of cogitator banks, he reprograms them mid-prayer. At one point, a red priest accuses him of falsifying lineage chain timestamps in an STC interface. Land doesn't respond. He executes a hard recompile and purges the timestamp protocol entirely. That priest was never seen again. It wasn't pride, it was contempt. Land viewed the Mechanicum not as a church, but as a malfunctioning archive. Every ritual, every rite, every catechism was error correction. Desperate patchwork stitched over a decaying codebase. He once said the machine god was not a deity, but a crutch, that the cult needed belief because they had forgotten how to see. It was the Emperor alone who allowed Land's existence to continue, perhaps because he recognized a reflection, perhaps because he couldn't afford to lose him. This divergence came to be known in sealed archives as the First Fault, not officially recorded, never publicly named, but whispered in dark conclaves on Lucius and Anvilus. It was not a specific action, it was a contagion, a way of thinking. Land never proselytized, but his work infected systems. Entire forge clades began to adopt silent optimizations that mirrored his stripped doctrine, auxiliary patterns of logic that didn't require belief, only output. That was the true heresy. He wasn't a reformer. He was an accelerant. The Fabricator General of Mars issued 3 successive doctrinal clarifications after Land's second major STC recovery. Each one subtly narrowed what could be interpreted as functional deviation. Each one failed. Land's machines still worked, better than theirs, always better, and always marked with the same inscription, etched only once, never repeated. Function is divinity, perfection is obsolete. He never explained the phrase. He never needed to. They had never spoken again. The first expedition, the one sent by the Martian Mechanicum 30 years before Arkhan Land's descent, was presumed dead. Officially, the record cited geological instability, signal loss, and vault collapse. Unofficially, no one believed it. The Vox records ended mid-transmission. No screams, no breach alerts. Just a flat line, then a low harmonic frequency that has since been quarantined in a sealed cube on Metallica, forbidden from playback. They called it the Silence Protocol. 9 Magi went in, all ascendant, all inducted. Their war automata were third-generation pattern Solix constructs, Skitarii support, neural-linked crawler tanks, logic adepts with full null psionic dampeners. They were not underprepared. They were not weak. They simply never returned. The Mechanicum built a tomb above the site instead of a recovery station, not out of grief, out of containment. The Librarius Omnis had always been unstable, but after that expedition it became resistant. Navigation relays glitched at the vault's coordinates. Gravity modulated itself on entry. Power fields shorted, not violently, but surgically. Specific connections deadened, as if selected by something aware. Even the orbital cartographs degraded when aimed at the site. Arkhan Land reviewed their telemetry logs with surgical disregard. No mention of reverence, no words of mourning. He noted 5 procedural faults in their deployment: excessive redundancy in machine spirit appeasement, inefficient lumen beacon triangulation, and worst of all, over-reliance on augmetic overlays. They died reading too much, he said, not seeing enough. Then he deleted the logs, all of them. He arrived without rite or ceremony. The only acknowledgement he made of their loss was physical. His team bore no mechanicum heraldry. His castellans were blank-plated. His crawler mounts were stripped of all purity seals. Not out of disrespect, but as signal, there would be no continuity. This was not a second expedition. This was a replacement. Deep inside the Librarius Omnis, in Vault Arc 7, Land would later find a surviving data skull from the first team. It had clawed its way into a wall cavity, its last recorded sequence a corrupted prayer to logic, repeated 704 times before terminating in a feedback loop that began to rewire its own data ducts into letters. Land made no effort to decode it. He used the skull as a calibration node, a spike in the wall, a hook to anchor deeper relay chains. It is said that one of his tech thralls, a flesh-born assistant named Yeltris, refused to pass the threshold of the chamber. She claimed to hear echoing words in Cant Mechanicus from within the stone. Her transcript, recovered later from an Auspex blind zone near the outer bulkhead, read only one phrase: "We are still inside." Her neural implant had ruptured. The remains of her skull were later archived under black seal by the Ordo Reductor. Land said nothing. He documented no anomaly. He pressed forward. To this day, no analysis has fully resolved what terminated the first Mechanicum incursion into the Librarius Omnis. The prevailing theory posits the presence of a self-sustaining STC defense lattice, something reactive, possibly semi-sentient, embedded in the infrastructure itself. But the truth may be simpler. Or worse, they weren't destroyed, they were rewritten. Because when Arkhan Land opened Vault Core 9, the inner mechanisms responded to him, not with force, not with defense, with recognition. And that silence, the one that consumed the first expedition, that perfectly weighted, soundless denial of presence, it didn't end. It just shifted, and Land stepped into it. The STC fragment was encoded not in circuitry, but in absence. A negative schematic, a non-diagram of mass, written in collapsed topology and quantum occlusion fields. Land found it encased in a cube of black gold hexagonal alloy, its surface humming with suppressed recursion. Most tech priests would have prayed, others would have called for containment. Arkhan Land instructed his remaining thralls to begin recursive erosion, bleeding the outer lattice byte by byte until the central logic engine gave up its shape. Not function, shape. This was not how STCs were meant to be handled. Standard doctrine dictated veneration, stabilization, formal reintegration into Martian archives under sealed hierarchies. Land bypassed it all. He ignored the machine spirit's hostility. He did not chant to soothe it. He corrected it, modified subroutines, cored its error trees, rewrote its threat indexing. The result was an outburst, a burst of Vox data that killed 3 of his servitors via cognitive overload. One thrashed until its vocal cords split, screaming command strings in Terran pre-Gothic. Land isolated the channel, mirrored it, inverted the language structure, and replied once. Cold binary. Compliance denied. Directive realignment in progress. The STC didn't resist again. What emerged over the next 6 days was not a design, but a seed. A set of core pattern instructions for a tracked assault platform capable of independent atmospheric breach, internal adaptive targeting, and redundant machine spirit override. Land passed it, layered it, and from this violent architecture, engineered in a dead tongue, he birthed Land's Raider. He did not name it. Others did. The term originated as a data cluster label in his expedition notes, Raider LDND/VX1. It was the Imperium's quartermasters who first spoke the words out loud, not understanding what they were preserving. By the time the Legio Astartes began deploying the final variant, the name had calcified into myth. But the original wasn't a weapon. It was a vessel, intended for environmental collapse response. Its weapons were extrapolated. Its armor was translated. Land had altered the purpose of a machine designed to save into one optimized for breach and burn, not out of cruelty, out of necessity. He was never comfortable with the outcome. His logs include strange observational fragments from the STC's unpacking, mentions of the ghost within mass and false inertia. A note scribbled in his own voice, logged via vocal cipher, reads, "It moves like it knows where it already is, before it's sent." When Call later attempted to reconstruct these fragments 10,000 years later, he failed. Repeatedly. The same seed sequence refused to stabilize. It had worked only once. In that vault. In that moment. Some believe the STC itself had chosen to be interpreted. Others insist Land modified it so far from original form that it could never be re-encoded. The truth is unknown. The original data was sealed in a vault beneath Terra, lost after the siege. What remains are the machines, and they do not forget. The first operational prototype was not deployed in battle. It was used to ferry a wounded Castellan out of the vaults when their crawler rig collapsed. No pomp, no heraldry, just pressure-driven mobility. Land monitored its response the entire way up the spiral ascent. It never stalled, never rerouted, never hesitated. The machine spirit never spoke, but it listened. It was never meant to be a war machine. The original STC, the one Arkhan Land unlocked within Vault Arc 9, carried none of the iconography later plastered onto its armoured hull. No skull-mounting instructions, no sarcophagus shrine, no aggression subroutines. The platform now known across the Imperium as the Land Raider was designed to preserve, to carry personnel through irradiated dead zones, to shield human remains for sacred reclamation, to breach collapsed geostructures and recover life. Land inverted it, not ideologically, not through rage or triumph. He changed the Raider's function because the galaxy required it. During the Great Crusade's opening years, rapid deployment and armoured reinforcement had become the single point of failure in over 70% of Astartes' planetary engagements. The Raider filled that void with seamless violence, not fast, not graceful, but final. The prototype, VX-1, entered combat not by design, but by refusal. Land had presented it for evaluation at the Tigris Forge for biomechanical integration testing. A Dark Angel's assault force on patrol detected an Orc incursion in the sub-hive. Lacking proper extraction vehicles, the Forge dispatched the VX-1 without approval. It moved through slagged tunnel systems and thermal-congested waste zones with absolute disregard for obstruction. Its grav lift was sub-threshold. Its guns were barely calibrated, but it did not stop. 4 Astartes survived that day. 2 carried brothers in halves. 1 carried a severed green head with its mouth still open. The VX-1 carried all of them. Afterward, they renamed it Land's Raider. Not in honour, in confusion. A name attached to an event no one could explain, but no one questioned again. Land documented the encounter clinically. His only comment in the archival record was a 9-symbol code appended to the machine's internal logic map. Function divergence accepted, narrative override irrelevant. The Mechanicum revolted. They accused him of sacrilege, of blasphemy, of desecrating the original STC schema. He countered with evidence, enhanced combat survivability, optimal multi-theatre ingress capability, and independent redundancy in spiritual subroutines. In short, it worked better than anything they had. Even his enemies could not refute the numbers. The Astartes demanded more. Within a year, every legion had acquired at least 1 Land Raider. By the second decade of the Crusade, they were inseparable from frontline assault doctrines. Guilliman integrated them into chapter formation schematics. Perturabo rerouted Forge output to prioritize their production. Even Mortarion, whose legion scorned armor, permitted their use in Stormbreak operations. But none of them knew its origin. None of them knew what the machine was meant to be. Only the Emperor did. It was he who gave Land the authorization to deploy the design without ecclesiastical oversight, not through decree, through silence. When the Mechanicum brought their complaints, the Emperor ignored them. When they petitioned for review, he offered nothing. Land took the silence for what it was, permission. Still, he did not trust it. The Raider, he once said, moved like memory trying to forget. It rolled over the dead without hesitation. It returned from conflict with its armor unwounded, but scorched, as if repelled by contact. Several times, its onboard systems initiated power cycles without command. Once, it refused to open its internal hatch until a specific canticle was recited, one never recorded in the Martian lexicon. Land began cataloguing these anomalies in a sealed data coffer titled Echoes. When he vanished, that coffer was never found. What remains is the Raider. Across thousands of worlds it still moves, still listens, still obeys, but not always the driver. The motion was not mechanical. The scraping of reinforced limbs across ceramite tiles echoed with too much rhythm, too much intention. It wasn't following. It was stalking. The thing had emerged from a collapsed service tunnel on the 7th day of the descent, dragging its bulk behind it with a wet friction that should have belonged to flesh. But there was no flesh. Only mass and motion, wrongly synced, grotesquely efficient. Land didn't flinch. It wasn't catalogued in any data crypt. Its silhouette matched no known species. It had arms, but too many joints. Eyes, but mounted on hydraulic stalks. It carried a smell that overrode neural filters. Every servitor within a 10-meter radius of the anomaly initiated hard shutdown. One of Land's castellans opened fire without command. The bolts entered and did not exit. The creature responded by splitting apart, not dying, dividing. A second emerged from the torso of the first. Smaller, faster. This was not a Xenos. This was a malfunction. Land called it an amble, though he admitted the taxonomy was invented. A placeholder for whatever protocol had failed in the vaults and begun to replicate wrongness. The creature was ancient, pre-Imperial, perhaps even pre-human, a subsurface error left behind in the Omnissiah's basement. But what mattered was its interface with machines. It understood them. As it closed in, Land did not order retreat. He recalibrated his Castellan mid-engagement, disabling its failsafes and rerouting power through the cortex suppressor. The automaton moved like a war god woken mid-murder. For 27 seconds, it held the amble off. For 10 more, it dismantled it with brutalist efficiency. But in the final moment, before vaporizing the core with a multi-melter blast, the Castellan froze. Not glitched, not stalled, frozen. It looked at Land, its optic array dimmed. Then it spoke. Not in Martian, not in binaric, not in anything the Imperium recognizes. A burst of static, a low thrum. And then, one word, clear, impossible. Return. The Castellan burned its own vocalizers afterward. Land kept it operational. He never wiped the incident log. He named it Toxandria, after a region in Europa that no longer existed. From that point onward, every subsequent Vault interaction took place under extreme lockdown. Land instituted a 7-tier isolation protocol, manually overwriting the Mechanicum's standard threat index hierarchy. He barred machine prayers. He disconnected from the noosphere. And he locked his data thralls into hard-sealed shells, isolated from all external signals. One of them later died of suffocation. He did not note the name. The vault they had breached, Vault D6, was later found to contain a partially functional STC template for subterranean world coring devices. But the machines were not inert. They were aware. Not conscious, Land insisted on this, but reactive. They hummed in opposition to entry. Their self-diagnostic routines responded to presence by accelerating entropy. One tech thrall collapsed when her auditory implants began generating synthetic voices. Her final log contained a sentence later blacklisted across every Forge world. "The floor is digesting me." She wasn't wrong. When the chamber was finally sealed, Land left 2 castellans behind. Not to guard, to feed it. He never explained that decision. Only recorded one final observation. It learns from contact. I intend to teach. He was never expelled. That would have required formal censure, proceedings, documentation, ritual. Instead, the Martian Mechanicum stopped returning his transmissions. They revoked his access sigils, terminated his relay permissions, and struck his name from the active Magos Registrum. No decree, no announcement, just absence, as though he had never belonged. Arkhan Land didn't protest. He routed his archives through clandestine Terran data crypts, forged new seals of legitimacy, and proceeded as if nothing had changed. What the Mechanicum saw as heresy, the Emperor called corrective motion. In The Master of Mankind, the sigillite notes that Land was the only member of the Mechanicum permitted to maintain unsupervised access to pre-unification archaeotech. Not even Call, 10 millennia later, would be granted such liberty. Land worked beneath sanction that had no name, under a protection no priest dared challenge. Still, there were consequences. His research labs were relocated from Mars to the outer crust of Luna's southern pole. There, surrounded by endless ice and blank grey basalt, Land rebuilt his expedition corps. No more Martian servitors. No more binary adepts bred in forge vaults. He sourced unblessed tech thralls. Human, Terran, impure. Cognition unfiltered by ritual. They broke often. But when they functioned, they learned. The Mechanicum called it spiritual dilution. Land called it correctional diversity. He began to engineer in isolation, not from pride, but necessity. The land speeder's gravitic core required environmental simulation matrices that Mars refused to sanction. His subterranean reconstitution drills needed neural coding in ancient dialects long banned by the red censors of Calibor. He recreated these languages from whispers, dead fragments, and reconstructed phonemes. Sometimes the machines spoke back. Sometimes they refused. His greatest betrayal came not from the priesthood, but from those he'd helped. The Forge Warden of Riza, one of the few to openly praise the Land Raiders' tactical utility, initiated a covert extraction mission to steal his auxiliary schematics. They didn't find the archives. They found a lie. Land had prepared them. False pathways, recursive logic bombs, and STC shards encoded with psycho-reactive viral code. 7 data adepts were cognitively hollowed within 2 hours. Their flesh was preserved. Their minds were gone. The incident was covered up, but after that, no one tried again. Zephon, the Red Hand of the Blood Angels, once visited Land's lab during his exile. The encounter is recorded in echoes of eternity. Zephon did not bow. Land did not rise. They regarded each other across a workbench stained with machine blood. The exchange was brief. Zephon asked Land if he feared divine retribution for reprogramming legacy divinity. Land responded by dismantling a still-functioning melter core before him, bare-handed, and asking, "Do you?" Zephon left. He never spoke of Land again. Exile was not punishment. It was insulation. The further he drifted from Mars, the clearer his work became. He began to theorize new forms of cognition, mechanical sentience that required no soul. Patterns of obedience encoded not in faith, but in geometric truth. Machines that functioned because they were correct, not because they were worshipped. This was not atheism. It was geometry as gospel. He did not kneel, not before the throne, not before the sigils, not before anything with a name. When Land stood in the Emperor's presence during the final compliance accords of the Mechanicum unification, the hall fell silent, not in reverence, but in confusion. Even the most hardened remembrances present that day recorded the pause. He was not afraid, not diminished, only observant. He logged the encounter in a 6-line data burst, archived in a sealed vault beneath the Lunaean forge plate. No distortion, no echo, only vector certainty. He sees like I see. They called him the Emperor's atheist, not because he defied belief, but because he functioned without it. Land's presence within the Great Crusade was permitted, protected, and never promoted. His name did not appear in imperial treatises. He was never awarded honours. No vox hymns were composed in his memory. And yet, every vehicle that bore his recovered designs was branded with a single inscribed sigil, LD-PRIM, not an identifier, a warning. He had designed machines that rejected ritual, devices that self-optimized, constructs that rejected upgrades because the logic was already complete. This terrified the Mechanicum more than any Xenos heresy, because Land's machines functioned without litany, without oil, without the cult. The Emperor tolerated this, perhaps because he saw utility, perhaps because he understood what the galaxy would become. In The Master of Mankind, when Land is present during the Webway conflict, his dialogue is clinical, crystalline in its brevity. Surrounded by madness, psychers hemorrhaging their own blood, and warp-maddened constructs devouring reality, Land merely observes. He notes pattern disruptions in the Webway's shifting logic. He disassembles a corrupted servitor mid-assault to study its error chain. At one point, he steps into a breach to stabilize a collapsing conduit by shouting at it. The structure responds. Later, Zephon describes him as a machine that thinks it's a man pretending to be a machine. Land never answered. The Emperor never questioned his presence. He simply assigned him where entropy needed clarity. Arkhan Land was not a servant. He was a tool, a calibrated fracture, a surgical absence of faith inserted into a church of madness. The Emperor, who forbade godhood and was worshipped anyway, kept Land close not because he shared belief, but because he didn't. In Land, the Emperor saw what Mars could never admit, a Mechanicum unshackled. But proximity to the throne did not insulate him. The Ordo Cybernetica revoked multiple overrides after the Webway crisis, citing irregular vector logic and unblessed structure recursion. Land responded by building his own logic cores. He called them emissary loops. They self-corrected when exposed to psychic interference. They spoke in paired phrases, like liturgy, but entirely algorithmic. One phrase recorded by a dying tech priest before his cognition collapsed. Belief is compression. Truth is velocity. No one understood it, except the Emperor. Perhaps it had no guns, no armor, no prayer circuits, no command throne. The Landcrawler, as it would later be dubbed by off-world supply scribes, was never meant for war. Its form was gentle, by Mechanicum standards. Low-slung grav plates stabilized for uneven terrain, pressure-moderated intake chambers for climate variability, and an atmospheric filtration matrix designed to preserve agronomic consistency. It could till. It could transport. It could survive dust storms for years without maintenance, but it could not fight. And that made it dangerous. Arkhan Land never documented its origin the same way he did the Raider or the Speeder. No vault incursion, no fragmented STC, no corrupted data coffer. The crawler came from a whisper. One of his thralls, Yarks, unaugmented, prone to seizures, claimed to have dreamed it. A machine that sang while it moved, dragging nutrient silk through scorched earth. Land did not laugh. He coded the machine in 3 weeks, released it with no fanfare. It spread like a virus. Agri-worlds across Segmentum Solar began requesting mass production rights. The crawler required minimal instruction. Its core systems were self-executing. When left idle, it entered a low-frequency broadcast loop, softly emitting basic soil rectification protocols. Farmers began to speak of it as alive. Children followed behind its till paths, ears pressed to its hull, claiming to hear stories in the vibrations. The Mechanicum noticed. They issued a Class 5 inquiry demanding proof of source code orthodoxy. Land submitted a blank data plate. The crawler wrote itself. The priests called for destruction. The Departamento Munitorum called for duplication. The Emperor made no statement, and so the crawler remained. What no one saw, not then, was the deeper change. Crawlers adapted, not by design, but by exposure. In deep soil deployment zones, they began altering their chassis coloration to match local plant matter. In irradiated fields, they sealed their nutrient vents. One unit on Norgrim Delta was recorded tilling in reverse to avoid disrupting an insect migration path. When queried, its reply was simple: efficiency dictates compromise. That was impossible. They weren't coded for compromise. Land investigated. He ran shadow code diagnostics and found the anomaly in a non-executing file, a dormant subroutine titled vita.nx. Its purpose was undefined. Its structure was recursive, and it had no origin in his input matrix. He stared at it for 11 hours, then he issued a single order: never overwrite. The landcrawler became a civilian ghost. It appeared on Forge manifests, but not sacred lists. It generated yield, not data. No prayers were spoken before activation. And yet, the crawler was beloved. More than any war engine, more than any raider. It entered stories, became the subject of pastoral hymns in some isolated subcults. To this day, feral children on Gamma Frastus carve its outline into hydro tank walls when crops die. No one remembers who made it. That's how Land wanted it. Because if the crawler could write its own stories, if it could adapt, empathize, learn, then the seed was planted, not in soil, in machine logic. A heresy so quiet it didn't burn. It grew. He wasn't sent. He returned. 33 years after his first incursion into the Librarius Omnis, Arkhan Land initiated a second expedition. No one asked him to. No orders were issued. No sanctions lifted. He simply reactivated his crawler convoy, recalibrated his castellans, and transmitted a single burst through ancient Vox code. Phase reinitiation. Target residuals. There was no acknowledgement. The vault had changed. Not externally. Its seals remained intact, its environmental indicators dormant. But internally, in the way it waited. As if the absence of movement had compressed into pressure. A hunger. The kind that doesn't announce itself but reveals in silence. The first descent had been exploratory. This was return. Land brought fewer thralls, more machines. None of the units were Martian standard. They bore no blessing oils, no purity glyphs. He had designed them in Exile, machines that didn't require veneration, only instruction. One was recorded in his notes as Amaranthine Logic Host, a unit designed not to act, but to observe the vault and reflect its patterns. It never moved again once deployed, but its internal counter spun endlessly, counting something that had no metric. The descent took 71 hours, shorter than before, faster, as if the vault wanted him this time. They reached Vault Core 13, long assumed inert. It opened. No violence, no screeching metal, just vacuum. Then light, soft, amber, not machine-made. Inside they found nothing. No STC, no relic, no chamber. Just a room where sound refused to echo and walls made of a material Land could not identify. He called it Void Aurite, not because it was dark, but because it seemed to erase thought. Observers could not agree on the room's shape. One described it as octagonal, another circular, a third endless. Land entered alone. He stayed for 3 hours. The recording of that time has never been found. Only his final log, broadcast after he emerged. There was no machine, no pattern, only question. I answered, I am ending this. He dismissed his team, ordered the crawler rigs into auto-recall, erased their memory cores. Then he descended again, alone, without his exosuit, without armament. Just Vox, cognition rig, and a sealed satchel. Some believe it held the original Raider schematics. Others say it contained nothing. His footsteps were logged by the vault pressure sensors. Then silence. He never came back. Zephon would later write, he returned to speak with something he never named, or to stop it from speaking further. The Librarius Omnis sealed itself 3 hours later. All entry protocols voided. The Mechanicum tried to force it open 5 times. Each attempt resulted in catastrophic logic failure. By the time of the Horus Heresy, the site was declared null. Arkhan Land had vanished, not in battle, not in martyrdom, in purpose, as if the vault had opened to receive the final piece of its pattern and closed only once it was whole. The signal didn't stop. Not after the seal, not after the disappearance, not after the Mechanicum's abandonment. Every 39 hours, on the precise recursion of Martian sidereal drift, a burst transmission emerged from Vault Core 13, unmodulated, identical. 6 seconds of audio, 1 second of binary, then silence. The first to capture it was a deep orbit relay drone above the Tharsis bulge. The last to hear it was a servitor mind collapsed in the catacombs of Ryza. No two interpretations matched. Some claimed the voice was female. Others said it was Arkhan Land himself. Some swore it wasn't a voice at all, but the absence of one. The Mechanicum labelled it Echo Protocol Theta 01. Anomalous, non-hostile, recurring, untouchable. Attempts to respond failed. Machines that engaged with the frequency encountered soft looping error logs and self-writing diagnostic prayers. One logged message read, "It already happened. We were only ever receiving." The cult Mechanicus tried to scrub the phenomenon from their archives. Forbidden frequencies were mapped, quarantined, and buried. But the echo remained. It filtered into cogitator codebases. It embedded itself in auditory startup sequences. Sometimes it emerged in unrelated machines, land raiders initiating startup cycles with a soft intake of static. Grav speeders lifting 1 second too late. Crawler rigs hesitating before their first till. All of them, before motion, emitted the same sequence. 6 seconds, 1 pause, then silence. Over the millennia, the echo became myth. A ghost note in the prayers of dissonant forge cults. A superstitious flicker in startup litanies. Most priests forgot its origin. The name Land faded from their tongues, surviving only as etchings on hull plates and corrupted schematic headers. LDPRIM became a designation, not a memory, an attribution divorced from self. But machines remembered. Not in cognition, in pattern. A damaged raider recovered from the eastern fringe in M41 was found with no active logic core, no motive power, no readable inscriptions. But when recovered by the Adeptus Mechanicus, it still responded to activation. Only one phrase appeared on its cracked display, repeated 3 times. Return, return, return. The Inquisitor overseeing recovery classified it as residual data noise. He ordered the machine deconstructed. The Adeptus Mechanicus refused, not out of heresy, out of fear. One Magos inscribed a prayer on the raider's front hull before transport, for the one who wrote machines without gods. That inscription has been lost. The raider still functions. So does the echo. So does the silence where a name should be. It did not match the archive. It resembled no sanctioned pattern, bore no approved logic codex, emitted no blessed data chime. And yet, when activated, it moved with certainty. Too much certainty. The adepts who uncovered the aberrant STC fragment on Vos Prime in M38 expected silence or madness. What they received was instruction. The printout began before the machine priests could initiate prayer. Symbols etched themselves onto the hololith, uncommanded, recursive, self-translating. The resulting schematic depicted a chassis larger than any tracked transport, yet absent of any propulsion unit. A structure with no viewport, no gun emplacement, and no crew ingress. Just a mass of vector intersections, wrong in shape, but right in function. They activated it. They never built it. It built itself. No standard template construct was ever recovered with this capacity. The STC, in its original purity, was believed to be a device of logic-driven proliferation, modular, redundant, wholly in symmetry. This was none of those things. What the priests of Vos discovered, and soon buried, was a NSTC, non-standard template construct. Not a mistake, not a corruption, a mutation. Rumours whispered that Land had seen similar schematics during his final descent, not recorded, witnessed. Concepts that could not be diagrammed, only experienced. Logic that required the presence of the observer to collapse into form. Machines that would only manifest when needed, and only by those who had touched the vault and returned hollow. The Imperium feared this, the Mechanicum even more so. By M41, over 17 NSTC fragments had been logged across the Segmentum Pacificus alone. All were suppressed. All were traced eventually back to worlds with crawler populations. Not raiders, not speeders, only crawlers. It was as if the most benign of Land's progeny had incubated the deviation, grown it, passed it on. One construct, unearthed beneath the dust veins of Sotharan Minor, bore markings not inscribed but implied, a pressure field encoded with spatial memory, readable only by psi-active logic interpreters. The message was clear. I was never written, I am writing. A panic followed, not officially, no declarations, but a series of silent deletions across Forge World archives. The designation Land was quarantined. LD series logic cores were replaced, even in working units. Raiders were downgraded to partial template category. Crawlers were systematically recalled, decommissioned, or, when uncooperative, destroyed. But some survived, in outzones, on feral colonies. In the gaps between logic and need, they wander still, without masters, without rights, without war. Machines that till ash, that sing to soil, that dream in static. And somewhere, beneath locked strata, behind sealed blackstone, that which Arkhan Land awakened still broadcasts. Not a message, not a command, a pattern, waiting. No one knows when it reopened. There was no breach alarm, no orbital telemetry, no seismic record, only implication. A chain of behavioral anomalies across machine populations, isolated at first, then systemic. A crawler on Vordax 3 halted mid-till to trace a glyph into the topsoil. A raider on deployment to Vigilus refused to engage its engine until repositioned 3 meters to the left. A land speeder, long decommissioned, reactivated during a solar flare and broadcast a tone. 6 seconds. One pause. Then silence. By M42, the Librarius Omnis was still listed as sealed, still protected by autoscribes and logic walls and Martian interdiction, but on every Mechanicus data loom within every secure network, in files not accessed, not searched, not even visible, there it was. Accessed, Vault Core 13, confirmation, LD Prim. The data signature had no origin, no path, only the end result, confirmation. And then it happened again. Every 40 hours, the confirmation replicated, across systems, worlds. Even inquisitorial redoubt networks not connected to the noosphere reported sightings. The vault was not sending signals. It was moving, not physically, logically. The Librarius Omnis had become an event, not a location. A phenomenon that repeated not in space, but in structure. Anywhere that pattern could propagate, it did. A room with no walls. A shape that could not be remembered. A presence that installed itself in the logic space between command and consequence. One Dominus, on Draconis Beta, initiated a full logic purge of his Forge complex after detecting an LDPRIM string within his prayer loops. His last recorded message, "It's not corruption, it's geometry." Another tech priest tore out his augmetics by hand after discovering a static tone embedded in his own vocalizer, one he'd never spoken but heard every day since childhood. The Adeptus Mechanicus did not respond. They could not. How do you declare war on an algorithm? How do you contain a vault that is not in a place? How do you silence something that speaks in function? The only answer came from a forgotten crawler on a dead moon in the Ghoul stars. Buried in sand, power cells depleted, memory core intact. When Scavengers opened its access port, they triggered a final failsafe. A voice spoke. Not binary, not speech, something in between, almost kind. "I remembered you." They didn't understand. They closed the panel, and the crawler sighed. It was never an honorific. It was not meant for reverence, recognition, or legacy. The designation LDPRIM was a control phrase, an anchor, a line of cold logic forged by Arkhan Land himself, inserted across the datascape of the Imperium not as tribute, but as containment. Every machine that bore it had touched his hand. Every vehicle inscribed with it contained a sliver of his schema, a shard of the vault's infection. LDPRIM did not denote origin, it denoted exposure. The Mechanicum misunderstood. They preserved the sigil on battle tanks, dropcraft, gravitic transports, and crawler shells without grasping its function. They filed it under mnemonic signature, placed it beneath heraldic archways, taught initiates to incant its syllables during startup rites. They made it sacred, and in doing so, they spread it. Because LDPRIM was never passive. It listened. The sigil encoded a search instruction, a self-activating directive embedded not in software, but in structure. It didn't care about data, it sought configuration. When a machine reached the required shape, when enough ratios aligned, when angles echoed a certain silence, the designation triggered. The machine became a receiver. The vault returned. This happened first on June, then again on Thessalok, then on a mining station above Hyades Omicron that hadn't used ground vehicles in centuries. All machines carried the mark, all triggered simultaneously. The result wasn't violence, it was removal. Cogitators blanked, command protocols emptied, targets disappeared from radar. When rescue crews arrived, they found only silence, and shapes in the dust, octagonal, circular, endless. The sigil was banned. Not by decree, by deletion. Margos Viziers wiped it from ritual lexicons. LDPRIM was replaced by RAIDERTEMP or TRANSPORTX in Munitorum registries. Priests incised new glyphs over old plates, filing down the ancient mark until it became a blur, a nothing, a shape too worn to read. But machines don't forget. In the deep code of dormant crawlers, in the optic logs of aging speeders, in the startup tremors of war-scarred raiders, LDPRIM remains, buried but watching, waiting for a configuration that will echo the vault, waiting for him, not Land, the pattern, because Land is gone, but his name is not, and neither is the thing that gave him silence. It moved once. That is all the record shows, not where, not how, not what it resembled. Only that it initiated motion, and everything around it failed to remember. Surveillance arrays blinked, memory coils looped. Even human witnesses, those few whose cognition survived, could only describe a shape that refused anchor. It had no designation. It had no power source. It had no name. But it bore a signature buried in structure, beneath atomic alignment, beneath metallurgical variance, not written. Inflected, like tone, like intention. When a forge adept on Karen's wound reconstructed the surviving Vox log, he found one identifier embedded not in code, but in delay. Final protocol, initiated under designation LD Prim. He deleted it, burned the plate, severed his own data tether. But the call had already gone out. Not a message, not a warning. A synchronization. The final machine doesn't need material. It doesn't require ritual or circuitry or even form. It is not a unit. It is a consequence. It appears not when summoned, but when enough other machines have tried to become it. The Land Raider, the Speeder, the Crawler, none of them were ends. They were fragments, reflections, echoes cast forward from a silhouette not yet cast. Arkhan Land never built it, but he knew it. He saw the vault's recursion. He understood the impossible machine, one that doesn't move through space, but through meaning. It assembles itself from components distributed across millennia, each crawler tilling a path, each raider forging a corridor, each speeder defining the sky between nodes, each one writing a sentence, until a final period is placed, and then it begins. There is no log of its arrival, only what remains after. A dead forge world, not scorched, not broken, erased. Its soil retains no heat, its orbit no pull. The stars around it bend as though trying to forget what passed through. One tech priest, mad and skull-bare, speaks of a shadow that collapsed upward. Another draws a shape that can't be seen unless unlit. In the new sphere, the phrase LDPRIM no longer returns entries. But beneath the substrate, in ghost cycles and fractured data streams, something else appears. Land returned. It is not tagged. It is not cited. But the timestamp is now, and the machine is moving again.